Welcome to Capernaum, or as we say in Hebrew, Kfar Nahum, the village of Nahum. That's the original meaning of this place. Which Nahum is this village remembering? Or no one has an answer on this. Is it the biblical prophet Nahum or some private landowner? No one knows. Capernaum is also not mentioned and was not inhabited in the Old Testament. It became a small fishing village next to the Sea of Galilee. Down here, so you can see, we are along the northern shores of the Sea of Galilee, in one of the best fishing areas, because on the left is the estuary of the Jordan River, which brings plankton and fish, and on the right side you have springs with warm water, which also attract the fish. So the people inhabited this area for good reason. It's a short sail to either way, and there's a good chance of catching fish. In fact, when we leave, you might see today fishermen also find their luck in the catch of the day. And I hope you like fish. We can try some of the local fish for lunch today. But 2,000 years ago, this was a small Jewish fishing village, not known by much. Josephus mentions it once. That's it. And one day, a strange guy, not local, maybe even speaking a slightly different dialect, the dialect of the mountains, of the hills. He's coming from Nazareth. His name is Yeshua, Jesus in English. And he first walks here along the shore, reaching the fishermen and making them an offer. Join me and I'll turn you from fishermen to fisher of men. And I am the Messiah. Very heavy claims, that when he tried proposing them in Nazareth, they wanted to kill him. Okay, they rejected him. And when he went to Bethsaida, when he went to Chorazim, he apparently had opposition there as well, because we know that he ended up cursing those sites. He even cursed Capernaum at some point, which indicates that there was also opposition to his activity here too. But there were enough people accepting him, especially Peter, okay, who is a native of Bethsaida, but is apparently married to a girl from Capernaum. And Jesus will create a new home here. He will live here for at least 3 years, if we count in all the times that he made pilgrimage to Jerusalem. And he will use Capernaum as a base also to travel and sail in many different directions. He went to the Decapolis, he went to Phoenicia, he went to Jerusalem. And Capernaum has an advantage on being the seam of two Roman provinces or regions. The region controlled by Herod Antipas over here, and the area controlled by Herod Philippus over here. Okay, so these are all educated guesses as to why did he favor Capernaum, but I think at the end of the day it's because people did not reject him. Enough people, 12 people, accepted him, and this is the core of the early church and the 12 disciples. Now, all of this is fantastic, and we figured out Capernaum was here by 19th century scholarship. Edward Robinson, an American maverick, was the first one to travel here when this was all swamp, and suggests that the ruins he's seeing around him are all remains of ancient Capernaum. But let's be humble in our expectations. Even that Jesus lived here, and that you know the text to have such detailed account of what he did here, what do you expect archaeologically 2,000 years later to discover that can relate to any of the stories? Okay? Let's think about this. If Jesus goes on a mountain and addresses the crowds and gives a speech, even 5 minutes later there won't be any trace of that event. So don't expect me to trace archaeologically the Sermon on the Mount side, for instance. Okay? Or if Jesus heals a sick person, don't expect archaeology to detect anything of that too. So, I'm asking you, Ron, think about this. What kind of finds archaeology could potentially make that relate to the scriptures, of items mentioned in the scriptures?
Structures.
Oh, very good, because you're very focused with filming, but indeed. What archaeology detects is pottery shards, glass bits, coins, oil lamps, and buildings. And there are two buildings mentioned in the text about Capernaum that archaeology, in theory, could detect. What am I talking about? Which kind of buildings are we possibly talking about? The first one of them is the synagogue. The text mentions several times the synagogue of Capernaum. Jesus walks into the synagogue, he argues in the synagogue, he heals the daughter of the head of the synagogue. Okay? Do synagogues look different from ordinary buildings? Yes,
They
big
should.
time. They don't look the same. A private house does not look like a synagogue, just like a church doesn't look like a private house. They have a different architectural design. Okay, so one challenge is to find the synagogue of Capernaum. The second one is a bit more tricky because it's a house. But it's the house of the mother-in-law of Peter. Remember that story? It says in one of the stories that after being in the synagogue, they went to the house of the mother-in-law of Peter. She was sick, but Jesus healed her and she was instantly cured, and they served them dinner. In my opinion, he was just hungry. He wanted something to eat, so he healed her so he could have something to eat. But that's just my little personal humor. Can archaeology detect that home? Okay, that's more tricky, right? But let's start with the synagogue. Okay, and now look behind it. Does anything that you see behind you looks remotely like a synagogue? First of all, the stone itself is basalt stone. This is not characteristic to Jerusalem mountains, for instance. It's formed by volcanic eruptions, and it's typical to the Golan Heights, which is east of us. When the Golan Heights erupted, the whole area, including the Jordan River and the Sea of Galilee, was covered with this black basalt stone, so that becomes the natural building material. And what you have here is peasants and farmers and mostly fishermen fixing up the stones to make something very basic and very minimal, which they will call homes. Okay, they don't even hewn the stones. They just take field stones and pile them up. Sometimes they have bonding material. Maybe the doorway is a bit framed, it's a bit set. You see it?
Mm-hmm.
But that's it. It definitely doesn't look like anything fancy that could qualify as a synagogue. And if it was the home of the mother-in-law of Peter, there's no way of telling. But again, let's focus on the synagogue. It ain't here. We can agree on that. Okay, but follow me. Keep recording. You see that if we go around the corner, there's a display here of white limestone, which is not local, meaning they were brought from a distance. They were deliberately chosen from a quarry which is not here. And then look at the ornamentation. This is beautiful. Look at the artwork. What do we have here? You can see a cluster of grapes. You can see pomegranates, flowers. This is all very nice, but does it tell us which building it is?
Not a house.
It's not if it is a private house, he's super wealthy. So it looks like it's part of a public house. The decoration on the top here is very Roman in style, meaning it's from the Roman period. But if it's part of a synagogue, the artwork does not indicate that. It's very plain, very natural. There's no religious symbols in any of this. But keep going. And then what do you see here?
Oh.
The Star of David. But it's not a Star of David.
Okay.
Only in the modern times we associate those three triangles with the Star of David and with the Jewish symbol. Next to it is another 5-pointed star. It's just decorative at this stage.
Okay.
The Star of David was not a Jewish symbol at the time this building was created. So we still don't know the identity. This could be a church, could be a pagan temple, could be a secular public building, and could be a synagogue. But we have to find the evidence. Where do we have the evidence? Here's where you see the answer. On this capital, you have a clear relief showing a menorah. More than anything else, the menorah is the ultimate Jewish symbol that indicates Jewish identity. So all of a sudden, we can say with confidence, all of this decoration is part of a synagogue. And if you're still not sure, then next to it you have here a column part with an inscription engraved on it. And the language is Aramaic, which was the language of the Jews in antiquity here. Jesus' first language was Aramaic, by the way. And what is the contents? The contents is what usually appears on public buildings. You want to guess what that is? Thank you, Mr. Cohen, for your generous donation. So in this case, Aleppo, son of Zebedee, son of John, placed his column here, made ascribed to him as a blessing. And by the way, Zebedee is a name that appears also in the New Testament. We have here certain names that were just very common for this region in different times, which is another interesting note. But this is all part of the synagogue, except that the synagogue, according to the style of decoration, is not necessarily first century. We'll have to address this question. But where's the building itself? This is just a decoration placed at eye level. All of this was originally placed at the entrance of this. So we are now at the entrance into the synagogue, and all of that decoration that we were analyzing before, imagine it lined up over here, making this entryway very, very impressive. Currently only one element, that lintel above the door, is representing the fact that this was heavily decorated. The synagogue itself is on a higher platform, built in white stone. Pan to the left and look how within this black basalt neighborhood, that white synagogue stood out like a lighthouse. It was really an impressive design when you think of it. And let's walk inside. It had originally three doorways. This is the main entry. And the interior had a set of columns that was supporting not the rooftop but the second floor. You see that there's a doorway over there. You're showing it? Exactly.
Okay.
Okay, so this was actually a very big, very impressive, 2-story high synagogue. Wow. Quite impressive, especially when you consider the fact this was just a small fisherman area. That's very, very strange. But then the big troubling question appears, and that is the date of the synagogue. There's no doubt it's a synagogue. You can see the seating arrangement. It's oriented towards Jerusalem. We found Jewish symbols on it. No one questions the identity of the building. The big question remains, is it from the time of Jesus? Is it first century? How do you analyze a building? There are two ways. A, you analyze the architecture. And maybe for you and even for me, if I'm not an expert on ancient architecture, I wouldn't be able to tell the difference. But those who can tell you just by the shape of the capitals what is the date of the structure. Because these type of decorations, it's called a Corinthian capital, they change over the centuries. Another way to tell the date of a building is rip off the floor and see what dated material comes from underneath, which is why you're standing on cement. All of this cement is actually a fill of 24 cuts, sections that they've done under the floor to get dating material. And this is where the results were, let's say, confusing. Because the study of the capitals indicated the capitals were made in the 3rd or 4th century. But then the dating material found under the floor, and by the way, we found a lot of it. We just found a lot of small coins. It looks like they deliberately dumped small coins like we do today into a fountain to bless something. They deliberately dumped a lot of small coins to bless the building before constructing it, and some of these coins date to the 5th and even 6th century. So there is some disturbing gap between the time of the columns and the time of the underfloor setting. But one thing is clear. None of this dates to the 1st century, meaning this is a synagogue, it's ancient, it's from Capernaum, but it's not 1st century. Oops. So where is it? Where is the 1st century synagogue, not the 5th century synagogue, or the white synagogue as we call it today? You want to suggest?
No idea.
One option, maybe it's below it.
Okay.
We know as a pattern that often holy structures tend to be built at the same spot. They just renovate it again and again. And that's actually wrong. The other reason, the second reason why they dug beneath the floor here. And indeed, it turns out that beneath the so-called white synagogue, there's an earlier public building which may have been the 1st century synagogue. But the only place where you can see it today, follow me, is over here. Okay, if you tilt to the lower angle, you can clearly see a doorway. There's a wall here, there's a wall there. It's clearly not the same pattern as the foundation for the white synagogue. And this is very probably the 1st century synagogue, the one that Jesus entered and spoke and argued and performed miracles. Meaning he probably put his feet on that doorstep. And if it was up to me, Ron, if I was managing the site, I would move the white synagogue. Who cares? All those pilgrims coming here want to see the 1st century synagogue. But the owners of this property are the Franciscans, and they don't ask my opinion. So, for one thing, they never restored the white synagogue, and for another, nor did they remove it to show the 1st century synagogue buried beneath it. They actually had a big conservation project done a few years ago. I was hoping they would also do some more new digs, but nothing was done, and this is to this day the way you can see this place.
So it's just this one spot right now that's...
It's the only place visible, yes.
Mm-hmm.
If you go to the archaeological review of the site, the publication of the results, they were all published in books, you can see images and diagrams of what was found under the floor. But at the moment, I cannot show you.
Mm-hmm.
I would, for instance, put a glass floor. That's another way to show you something beneath. But it's a matter of money and will and interest, and currently, as far as I can tell, there's no interest in this. So, we've checked mark the synagogue. Tracking the synagogue of Capernaum, it's most likely beneath our feet. What was the second building that we were trying to track?
A house.
Which house, specifically? The house of the mother-in-law of Peter, which is tricky because we don't even know her name. Even if we find a doormat saying "Welcome to our house," we still don't know which house it is. Even if we find a sign saying the name of the family, the Cohens, we don't know if the mother-in-law was a Cohen family. We just don't know. So let's admit it is a big problem. But the Gospel of Mark, when he presents the story of being in the synagogue and then going to her house and healing her, he adds one word which is quite important. What is that word? Immediately. They were in the synagogue and then they went out and immediately entered the house. The word immediately implies
Adjacent.
it's nearby. It's adjacent to it. And that is why the Franciscans then dug all around here. Look at all the digs conducted all around the synagogue in attempt to find something that will be that house, or candidate at least. And they found a lot of houses here. But only there, do you see the modern building above it?
Right.
Only there did they find a house that later a church was built above it. Meaning in the 5th century, the house was sanctified, was marked, was framed, and a church was built above it for veneration. Now, also the church did not contain any inscription suggesting this is the place. But because of this stratigraphy, because of this unusual way of layering, we conclude today in the 20th century that this is maybe where they identify the house of the mother-in-law of Peter. We understand that it was built above a black synagogue, and it's the black synagogue that seems to date to the 1st century, meaning that's the synagogue mentioned many times in the New Testament. And the second riddle from an archaeological perspective is finding the house of the mother-in-law of Peter, which the Gospel of Mark indicates was immediately entered after Jesus was in the synagogue. So it had to be in the vicinity, and this is quite an immediate transfer from one house to another. But why do we think that this is the house? Because of the stratigraphy. What is stratigraphy? It comes from the Greek word strata, layer, the way the site is layered. And what we have here is a very specific set of layers, beginning with an ordinary house. Just like any other house in this neighborhood, this was a set of rooms made by local stone. The roof is just some branches. Very simple, basic, poor lifestyle of fishermen, as reflected also well in the New Testament. But 300 years later, not only are a few more rooms added, but there's a frame, a wall framing it, separating it from the rest of the village. Okay, if you use this diagram, then the blue walls are the original 1st century house. The green walls is the 4th century modification. And 100 years later, look what happens. An octagonal church is built above it. Now, churches are often built in a specific design which we call today basilica shape, which is long, rectangular, a bit like what the synagogue looks like. But sometimes Christians will build a church that is either round or octagonal, and that is only when they want to mark something in the middle. That church is designed to commemorate, sanctify, and mark something in the middle of the building. So this church was designed to mark something that was very holy for the people in the 5th century in the middle. What could that be? Although there's no sign anywhere, we assume that in the 5th century or in the 4th century, they identified this house as the holy house, the house of the mother-in-law of Peter. And visitors, or one visitor coming at that time, calls it actually the house of Peter himself, which is why the title labels it as the house of Peter. But it could also be the house of Peter or the house of Peter's mother-in-law. And you know what I think? It might also be the house where Jesus lived. The New Testament never tells us if Jesus had his own house, if he lived here anywhere. Maybe he was just enjoying the hospitality of Peter and his mother-in-law. That's my opinion, and I'll tell you why I think so. Because in the middle of this church, they found here, you see this element was a beautiful mosaic floor, and in the middle of it they found a very specific decorative element. The original isn't here, but a replica of it was placed here. Let me show you. Keep it on, and just imagine a big octagonal mosaic floor replicated and presented right there. Do you see it in the camera?
Yep.
Let's have a closer look. This was added just a few years ago, and I was so happy to see this because it's very indicative for my big theory. Okay, the outer octagon had also mosaic floors, but they didn't replicate it. They only replicated the central piece. The frame is all decorative elements. You can step on it because it's a replica. But Ron, what do you have here in the middle? Come over here. Exactly. From this angle, the image becomes quite clear. It's a bird with its wings spread. Which bird has its wings spread? The peacock. And this was placed in that church. What does it represent? If you wanted to represent Peter, a peacock is not a symbol of Peter. What is a symbol of Peter? Keys, because he gave him the keys for the kingdom of heaven, or maybe fish. Not a peacock. So what does a peacock represent? I did a lot of inquiries on this, and the best answer I could find, a peacock can sometimes represent Jesus himself. A, because it's the most beautiful male in the animal kingdom, and B, more important, because the feathers regrow every year. Regrow is like resurrection. So sometimes, and especially in Armenian art, you see peacock representing Jesus. Now, why would a peacock, a symbol of Jesus, appear in that house? Maybe because Jesus lived there as well, or they believe that he lived with Peter and his mother-in-law. And this is what makes this building so important. Now, if you look back at the church, okay, now there's a modern church on top of the ancient church. Look at this very interesting, unusual micro situation where you have a big church and a big synagogue side by side. That doesn't happen in antiquity. Even in modern times, usually, each one has its neighborhood. Capernaum was a little island, an enclave of harmony, it seems, between the Jewish community and the Christian community. And that's fascinating. But that's reflecting the 5th and 6th century Byzantine period. Beneath it, it's a 1st century fisherman house, a village of fishermen. The shoreline is right around the corner. And this is where Jesus operated. This is where Christianity, in a way, was born. All his revolutionary messianic messages and social messages of compassion, of caring for one another, this is where they were presented for the first time. Resonated by millions, billions to this day. That's pretty important if you're asking me.